A very good afternoon to all the viewers. Welcome back to another episode of BW People HR Voices. Today we have with us Ms. Pooja Luthra, the Group CHRO of the Trident Group. With over 21 years of experience in HR, she's passionate about helping organizations unleash the potential of their people. She's also the founder and CEO of Humane Insights, a leadership consulting firm. As a Gallup certified strength coach and an ICF accredited coach, she specializes in performance management, organizational effectiveness, and talent development. She has worked with CXOs across North America, the MENA and APAC region to build high-performing and engaged teams. She's also the board member of Mrs. Bector's Foods. Firstly, welcome, Pooja. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Savi. Thank you so much.
So, for all the viewers, today's conversation is going to revolve around work-life balance. So, Pooja, we all know the pros and advantages of having a work-life balance, but I want to start by understanding what are the most common challenges that come along with having a work-life challenge, achieving a work-life balance, and also how can HR leaders address these challenges?
Well, isn't that a hot topic, right? So to talk about work-life balance and as now we are saying it's work-life integration and coming up with all sorts of semantics to make the idea a little bit more palatable, I think, for everyone. But I really think, well, first and foremost, the responsibility of ensuring that integration is as much with HR as it is with immediate managers, as it is with leadership teams, and most importantly, as it is with the people, with folks themselves, and I'm not saying it just for the sake of it. I'll tell you why. I think first and foremost, as responsibility of the organization, it's a two-way street, right? So the responsibility of the organization definitely starts with ensuring realistic and clear expectations. And that is very, very important simply because when there is a mismatch, you have a social contract, you have an employment contract. So the social contract says this is what you'll be responsible for, and this is what you need to do. When that sort of is different from what actually is happening on the ground, sometimes the work-life balance challenge or the repercussions. What is work-life balance? Is literally it's a mental state in which you feel that you're not really settled or you're not really feeling as if you have time for anything else. That comes from a mental space of not really knowing what to expect, and that challenge is as much in our personal lives. When you don't know what to expect, it creates sort of a dissonance. And at work, you can call it work-life, a balance challenge or whatever it is that you would want to call it. I think it starts with the basic assumption of that. The second thing, which I feel, like I said, it's a two-way street. I often see that the ecosystem of an organization is the same, right? And yet there are people who have no issues at all. They are happy, they are thriving from a well-being standpoint. I'm not even talking about the work standpoint. From a well-being standpoint, they are thriving, and yet there are others who may be struggling. So, yes, it could do with the local ecosystem of, how I am with my manager versus how somebody else is with theirs. It's also to do a lot with how am I built or what is my mental framework to meet some of the challenges, and I don't want to put it on a generation. I don't want to generalize it to that extent. But sometimes when it comes with a point of view of, this is what was told to me and, I'm not flexible enough, or I am sure I don't want to do this, or I don't want to adapt to a certain situation. Now, these are things that organizations also don't plan for, right? I mean, it's an ecosystem in which things change. You've got to be adaptable. You've got to move, and things are not always handed to you on a platter simply because the organizations don't get it on a platter. We're in an environment in which both the regulatory framework, the marketplace framework, everything is very, very, it's getting more and more tougher.
Right.
In that sense. And when all of that that expectation is passed on, there are people who would take it naturally and say, okay, let's adapt because that's what's required. Others would sit down and say, this is not what I was cut for. This is not what it was meant. So I think there is a tad bit to do with how one approaches the situation as well. So
I agree.
that's my 2 bits.
Well, while we're talking about work-life balance, we have to discuss the 70-hour work week remarks made. What are your views on this? The Gen Zs, they are completely against this 70-hour work week. So what are your views on this?
Yeah, so it's like, when Shah Rukh Khan talked about the 70 minutes, he sort of got everybody together in one way. And when Ryan Murthy ji talked about the 70-hour work week, see, I think it needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. I mean, the idea is not about a 70-hour work week. It's not about a 40-hour work week or a 20-hour work week. I think the idea is in my opinion, and that's just to go with what it is. I think the idea was where he was coming from was more from a point of view of there is no alternative to hard work. And as a nation, if we are planning or if we want to be at a certain place, or as an organization, if you're aiming for certain things, while it's very important, everybody has that balance and everybody has that need for a well-rounded, thriving life, right? Be shirking away from work, if that's what you have opted to do, may not be the best way to get yourselves there. So it's not about, I mean, there are people who work half the time and are able to perform just as well. So when organizations who are smarter about it, they want to hold people accountable from an output standpoint, that let's go with the results, let's go with the goals. It's not about how many hours you're putting in, and I think that is also gradually changing. So it should be more outcome driven than input. So I wouldn't read too much into 70 hours or 80 hours or anything like that. I think it was just a huge this thing out of not much, in my opinion.
But with a multi-generational workforce, we have Gen Zs, Gen X, Gen Ys. Today, their needs and expectations of achieving a work-life balance is completely different to each other, right? So how can the organizations or the leaders, how can they inculcate these different needs and values into the policies of the organization?
See, it's very important. I mean, I think one thing is that you can't close your eyes and assume that it doesn't exist. With the generations, I think every new generation, whether it was millennials before this or Gen Zs now, we've seen a very, very big difference in what really gets them going, right? And it's a huge difference, and it doesn't help because I think all of us are aware that most organizations currently would be multi-generational. You would have Gen X, you would have Gen Y, you would have millennials, you would have Zs, everybody together. In many cases, the managers are of a certain generation. In many cases, it's the same generation reporting to the same generation as well. So it becomes very important for organizations to be pragmatic, and to not pretend as if the situation doesn't exist. So what that means in terms of policies, etc., is definitely some sort of a flexibility to say that, look, and I also believe that every organization has an ideology. So no organization can be a replica of the other in terms of the policies, because the industries are very, very different. Their ideologies are very, very different. So in the realm of whatever ideology organization stands for or what your industry permits, I think the idea is, the philosophy should be that you have an underlying ideology, you have systems to support that ideology, but finally, and the most important piece is, are you able to individualize it? And that individualization will not come from policy, Savi. In my experience, that individualization part is where the managers play a bigger role. As a manager, I could easily say, "Ye to organization ki policy nahi hai, we can't do it." Or as a manager, the manager could have the liberty, the authority to be able to say that, look, this is where we are, but I understand your unique situation, and this is how I'd like to help you in your unique situation. When you have managers who can take those calls at a local level, or organizations that encourage that to happen, then everything is more or less sorted, in my opinion.
Right. But, in today's digital age, when you have access to internet 24/7, managers, employees, colleagues, they don't think a second before texting the other person at odd hours. So
Yeah.
how do you maintain that kind of balance, even when you have technology in your hands 24/7?
See, technology in your hands 24/7 has a lot of other repercussions, work being one of them. I mean, being completely addicted. I have a 14-year-old who's addicted. I mean, she has no work to go to, but still that screen is on at all times. And there is a constant need to check for the next update and things like that. So I think that's a menace that we as a society face. And that is something that, again, we can't do away with. It's the way of life. You really can't take technology away. Again, I think it boils down to individuals to define their own boundaries. So, there are people, and the thing is that sometimes the difference is that sometimes people feel safe about defining their own boundaries, so telling colleagues and others that, look, I have a parent teacher meeting to go to between this time and this time, I will not be available, or I have something to attend to, so after 6 I'm not going to be available, or whatever the case may be. Then there are other ecosystems where the needs of employees don't change, however they don't feel safe enough to voice these boundaries. So I think as organizations, we've got to create that workspace that, again, look, output, productivity, all of those things are important for any organization, and everything should be determined like that. However, people should be given that space to be able to just define their own boundaries without being judged for it. So I think
Very well. Thanks,
yeah.
Pooja, for sharing that. But, October was the mental health months. And today we're seeing that burnout syndromes are on the rise. There's a lot of stress that's happening. So, as an HR leader, firstly, how do you identify these symptoms? Secondly, how do you eradicate these symptoms? What measures can be taken?
Safi, I think again, I'm going to go back. See, I worked for a very long time with a research-based organization. I worked with Gallup for a very long time. So, we went into the root of a lot many things. So, what comes across as a symptom is actually a more deep-rooted issue than what we what we can just see, right? The entire societal fabric has changed. Where are these Gen Zs and where are they coming from? They're coming from nuclear households. They're coming from parents who are, in most cases, probably both are working. I don't want to stereotype anything, but the kind of ecosystem that they have come from versus the kind of ecosystem that earlier generations came from is very, very different. So when we talk about a sense of entitlement, it's because they never had to really fight for security. They never really had to do something just to make a living. For them, it was already bought by their parents. And then all they had to do was sort of maintain it or enjoy it. And it's not a need for survival in that sense. It's a need where purpose is more important to them. So because of that reason, in answering your question, now burnout happens when you don't see a purpose, at least for the generations that we're talking about. And I've been interacted with enough and more campuses because as Trident, we are all about the younger workforce. We're all about giving chance to folks who are, they're new, they have energy and all of those things. So because of that, have interacted with so many students in different campuses, etc. And the one question that we are constantly asked is, what would be the purpose of my role? What is it? How much autonomy am I going to get to be able to prove myself? So what we see as entitlement, they see as a need for clarity, for purpose, to see if what they are doing is going to be important. And when they see a connection, then again, I don't want to generalize it and trivialize it that burnout nahi hota fir. That's very idealistic. But burnout in that sense becomes less simply because you are aligned and you know why you're there and why you're doing what you're doing. I think burnout tends to happen jab aap din raat when you're talking about things which ultimately you're like, I'm doing it, but I don't know why. I'm doing it, but I'm not happy. So when those things comes, I think burnout again is more mental than physical, right? I mean, it's not that I'm physically tired. Physically, I could be just sitting and working on my laptop all day. But mentally, when I don't see sense in that. So burnout ko handle karne ke liye, as HR at least, what's very important is for us to be able to tell them the purpose of the role that they are in. Tell them how is it that what I do adds up to the larger goal of the organization and why what I'm doing is important.
Right.
Whether I'm doing it well or not is another discussion. Lekin what I'm doing, is that important? So
Right.
that is something that I think, at least I feel from my conversations with them, that they have a higher need to understand this as opposed to some of the earlier ones, which were like, "Theek hai, kaam hai, work is work, one needs to do work, and work is not meant for enjoyment. So let's just go get it over and done with."
So
So
what
that
right. But what innovative strategies do you have in place? You also talked about working mothers. It's always a challenge for them to balance this need for work life, right?
yeah.
So what is Trident doing in this space? I want to know what are some of the innovative strategies that you have put in place?
So I think we've done some extremely innovative things, and also because it's good to have a diverse workforce, not just because it's a buzzword, but at least in an industry like ours. So, for example, we are big in textile and even spinning, etc. I think it becomes very, very important that women become a huge part of the workforce because that's what gets the business also thriving. Now we all understand where women come from in terms of the kind of obligations that they have on the family front, on the social front, etc. And to take you back another this thing, it's not just about, we are talking about modern women, we're talking about urban women. So when you start looking at tier 2, tier 3 cities, you start looking at the workforce there it's a patriarchal society where even getting women out is a challenge in itself. You've got to be sure of putting everybody in the family at rest about their security, about the fact that they're going to a good place, about letting them go there in the first place, etc. So keeping all of these things in mind, I think our efforts towards creating a diverse and inclusive workforce started not 4 years back, 5 years back. I think I can think about at least 20 years ago, that even then when we were hiring, at least at we call them karam yogis, the folks who are, on the shop floor and they're working. And then, as you grow up. So right from the karam yogi level till the leadership level, even campuses, we were very clear in our minds, even though that time we didn't say it out loud, that, we have to have at least 50% women. We just need to. So 50% women, us time pe the challenge was, how do you attract? Simply because it was unheard of, it was lesser, nobody was really talking about it. So at that time, we started looking at the idea of, and at that time, it was huge that when you start looking at the idea of equal pay, everybody gets paid equally. It's not a difference at all. And you get paid really, really well. And for a lot of women, that meant lending that financial stability to the families that they came from. So we've got so many success stories that, bring you to tears when women talk about the fact that they could sponsor even their own weddings. They could sponsor education for their children. And when women get financially independent, it changes the course of the family. That is for sure, right? So that was one part of it. I think back in about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, again, when it was unheard of, we realized that when you're talking about karam yogis, they're standing for a very long time. We started giving menstrual leaves back then. So, now you see organizations saying menstrual leaves hai, ye hai, wo hai. Hum logon ka tab se hai. And you ask any lady in the organization, I mean, she knows exactly what it is and the 2 days, etc., that you need to give. In comparison to everybody else, and sometimes to the angst of the male colleagues, all women in the organization get about 30 days extra leave in a year. So we call them Asmita leaves. The reason is, again, Karwa Chauth thakal, for example, you have Rakhi, you have things like parent-teacher meeting, you have a sick child at home, you have, in-laws to take care of, parents to take care of, etc. So all of those things, I'm not saying it's not something which is not the responsibility of the male of the family, but it's always assumed that the women would be there to sort of manage the whole thing. And those obligations should not take a backseat just because it's a working, because then that becomes like a taboo, that, you're a working woman, you're never available. And I think rural again, think semi-urban again. So in order for us to be able to counter all of that, the 30 extra days of leave gives them that flexibility to take time off, do whatever it is that they need to do without compromising on one or the other. And we're very clear that if you're talking about 50% women overall, it's not just in the masses. So we are very, very closely looking at women who are in leadership positions in Trident, who are in the middle level positions. Whenever we give growth or whenever we give people the opportunity to apply, like high potentials, etc., our eye is always on that number, that how many women applied, how many women got through. We want to be able to break that stereotype. Yaar, iski to shaadi ho jayegi, should we or should we not? That conversation cannot happen here in Trident. So we're doing a lot.
It's so lovely to know what Trident has been doing in this space for a very long time now. Well, but what about international teams, Pooja? They work in different time zones. There's always this challenge of collaborating with teams working in India versus teams working internationally. So how can that be managed?
So I think that's true for any organization again. And for us, we have teams all over. We have in Middle East, we have Europe, UK, US, everywhere. And I think it's been a lot of give and take. One is, of course, technology has made it rather simple. And if everyone knows they have the flexibility to be on and off at whatever times, people don't typically mind because they understand that and they know they can make it up elsewhere. You're not really spending 24 hours or whatever. So that's sort of a thing that we do. So we do have, so for example, one of the big events for textiles is always a market week, which happens in the US. So, you have a few people who are representing the company there to the customers. But obviously the back end work is happening here, right? So you see folks working through the night because the customer is there in the morning. And then we make sure they have the flexibility to take time off. If they have spent more than 10 days out without their families, we are very clear that the next 10 days can be spent at home. You work at your own flexibility because we understand it takes a toll on the family also, Savi. It's not just the person. If the family pressure can be huge, if the husbands are not there or the children are not there, whatever. So we try and ensure that we are sensitive to that folks who are what we call in a hardship situation like that, and hardship means time away from family. So you have not been with your kids, you haven't seen your kids in a while. So we have that sort of flexibility. Of course, when it comes to we encourage a lot of in-person meetings, even with international teams. So every second month, either a group would be in the US or the UK or Middle East or whatever, or these guys would be traveling here as well. So it just creates, and I think we all understand that, technology being one thing, there is nothing that can beat collaboration when it comes to being in person. You see the person, you do all of those things. So we try and maintain some of that as well. Now, fortunately, our industry is not, a tech industry in which, you've constantly 24/7 on this thing. I mean, we are a more typical, traditional sort of an industry. So the requirement of doing this incessantly is not super high for us. So that, it's not that, nahi hoga to kya hoga type thing. So it's very flexible in that
Right.
sense.
Lastly, Pooja, most of our viewers, they are HR leaders, they're employees. What would be your last piece of advice to them?
I'm really not the expert on advices. I think the idea is, and I don't want to sound cliched either, but I think more than we've spoken about satisfaction in the past. We've spoken about employee satisfaction. Now, why am I saying it's a thing of the past? Because satisfaction as a notion spoke about material benefits. It spoke about your needs and what really met those needs to keep you happy. Usme problem ye aayi that satisfaction is very, very short-lived. Today, one thing makes you happy, tomorrow another thing makes you happy. So I think organizations realized this earlier on, that that's not going to get you anywhere. Then we graduated to the idea of engagement, that, we want people to love what they do, because the emotions outplay the satisfaction part of it. So it's very important to be able to do that. And that continues to be important. But I think now organizations should and need to think about overall thriving well-being. So whether it's financial, whether it's physical, whether it's community, whether it's social, whatever the case may be, it's important for organizations to understand that just because we're talking about, let's say, community well-being, that is as much our responsibility as a career well-being. Earlier, it used to be limited to a person's time at work. But now, because of this whole integration thing, I think we all understand that we have a responsibility towards folks for overall thriving well-being. We have a responsibility, and for an organization our size, Trident is a huge organization. We are a huge employer, and we've prided ourselves on the fact that from a nation building standpoint, we have opened the gates of employment. So I don't know if you know about it. We have a flagship program called Takshashila that invites folks to apply for roles within the organization. And these are folks who are not from your fancy MBA colleges or, engineers or anything like that. These are simple folks who up until now may not have had the opportunity to prove their mettle. So from a nation building standpoint, I think my last, like you said, advice, I think it's very important to also look outside in, that what are we doing for the community in general? Because if the community thrives, there is no way your organization won't. So it's important for us to play that role towards the community and towards our folks for our overall well-being. And then all your policies, your systems just should automatically align towards that. And I think things work out. So it's commonsensical in a lot of ways.
Well, thank you, Pooja. Thank you for joining us today. We had a lot of fun having you here on our episode. And I think a lot of people are going to take inspiration from what Trident is doing in this space. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having Savi. Love to interact with you again in the future.